Okay. Imagine for a moment that we are somewhere else, on different trains and tubes, travelling to the centre of London. We are Philip Stanier and Penny Newell, and we are currently collaborating on a practice as research project, which explores the relationship between clouds and utopian thought for the Utopia 2016 event produced by Culture at King's College London. Utopia 2016 celebrates the 500th anniversary of Thomas More's book by the same name. When Thomas More coined the term utopia in 1516, he formed a portmanteau using the Greek ou, meaning not, and topos, meaning place, an etymological root sharing a stem with more familiar terms, topography, topological, toponym. Utopia does not denote a place of perfection. It is instead the notness of place, a non-place, as Auger might say. With this in mind, our collaboration through clouds has been one of seeking to cite performance in the non-space of clouds. We've been travelling into the clouds together in order to attempt to establish the non-sightedness of utopia within the deformatory, collapsing and evolving and transmutational site of clouds. Citing performance in the clouds amounts to 4 outputs. The naming of clouds as a project consists of a durational performance of stranded cloud walkers occupying a public courtyard, a scripted solo performance exploring the possibilities of walking on clouds and the potential impacts of this on humanity, a pamphlet that presents the research dimension of this project in the form of a commissioned drawing and that invites the public to contribute back into the project through their own drawings, and a public talk on the formation of the project itself, and this is the initial starting point of that talk.
So we began with the idea of travelling in and that linguistic construction of utopia. Now these 2 ideas introduce the theme of today's paper. That is, we want to describe the process of merging our conceptual frameworks through a process of entering into the shared language of utopia, of a non-place of clouds. As the slides behind us should suggest, this is a conversation held through the material medium of visual art and sculptural art during a series of visits to the Science Museum, the National Gallery, Tate Britain and Tate Modern. Initially intended as a means of surveying the collections for information and works related to clouds, these walks allowed us to discuss the project, our understanding of clouds, and the developing and changing perception of clouds in art as seen through these collections. These materials mediated our different perceptions of clouds in art, our different discourses, and brought us into a shared linguistic domain. This shared language permitted us to think in overlapping conceptual frameworks. The collaboration merges my research into the conceptual history of clouds at King's as a cultural, scientific and aesthetic phenomenon, and Philip's professional performance practice. Together, we explored clouds in performance as a context for activating the imaginary of the audience. We started outside the National Gallery, and we're working chronologically here through the gallery spaces, the National, Tate Britain and Tate Modern specifically. We've joined the queue waiting outside the doors and waiting for them to open. Trafalgar Square is already full, and the sky is blue with fluffy cumulus, some streaks of cirrus. We take this as a good omen. The task is simple enough. Survey the works in the galleries for clouds and make any note of trends, developments and features of the representation of clouds that might both fit the project and our mutual understanding.
I come already minded that clouds before their naming would not be realistic. My own initial research had indicated that clouds had no names or classification before Luke Howard did this process 200 years ago. This left clouds as ambivalently defined entities, neither formed nor unformed. Before I read an article that Penny had written, and what struck me was that Penny was articulating a language that would define and enhance what I had been attempting to practically deliver in my work, something close to a poetics of clouds. Standing outside the National Gallery, I asked Penny to outline her research.
It's a common misconception that before the science of meteorology objectively described or named clouds, they existed as flimsy, ambivalent forms. That science brought clouds into being in some respects. That before they took their scientific names, clouds were non-forms. Phil's question struck me on two counts then. Firstly, I wanted to underscore the fact that science did not bring clouds into being. The scientific classification of Luke Howard is instead one conceptualization among many, within a long, tangible history of theorizing, aestheticizing, and conceptualizing cloud forms. This history far predates Howard's classification in 1803. My work starts with the Greeks, where we discover Aristotle associating clouds with theatrical gatherings as part of his natural philosophy. This association was the foundation of my article that Phil had read. It carries implications for the subsequent association of cloud forms and theatre forms. Thinking through this history of relating to, classifying and aestheticizing the forms of clouds, I wanted to draw Phil's attention to the fact of his own forgivable assumption. And so, secondly, I wanted to underscore the significance of our commonly held misconception that cloud forms came into being, that cloud forms came into existence with the science of meteorology. This commonly held belief tells us what the age of advancement of meteorology through the 17th to the 20th century did to clouds as forms. It naturalized an idea about clouds as formulaic, as mathematical, as cirrus, cumulus, stratus, nimbus, that actually arguably exists alongside the silly names you might come up with when you're a child looking up at the skies. So this is why clouds are essentially utopian. They are a non-place where the fantasies of children, theorists, and scientists sit alongside each other, are cited in the clouds as such. And for this reason, to cite performance in clouds is not to fantasize about undoing the science of clouds. Citing performance in clouds amounts, first and foremost, to shifting the register of how we speak about these forms. Clouds cite performance in a non-place, in a utopia in its truest linguistic connotation, a place in the skies that science would have us read through its historical fantasies of objectification, abstraction, and such.
In reference to Penny's shift of register, and to further that thought to include a shift of paradigm, I approached the National Gallery. My expectations being that I would discover, rather than an absence of clouds, a series of forgotten or overwritten histories. To find jumbled about the National Gallery clouds of divinity, of startling accuracy, of simplicity, of impossibility, all next to each other and even competing against the alternative modes of representation within the same work, as if, while in agreement about everything else, artists could not make up their mind as to the consistency and coherency of clouds. Up until this point, intuition had largely been guiding my research, and a notion that the behaviour of clouds from a rational scientific perspective should direct my poetics, but not as much as their cultural history. And yet, themes emerged at the National in the works: the place of the cloud in ferrying or conveying the divine, its relation to nature, and its deployment as a resource to be exploited. And the establishing and unpicking of these three areas had already formed major sections of my original script. It's worth outlining some elements of my creative process. Primarily, my practice has been to make performance pieces concerned with exploring the gap between concepts and their manifestation, and often staged with some deconstruction of certainty or concepts, or an exploration of the failure of representation or form to adequately present a concept. As such, I've made after-show discussion for a show that never existed, a series of photographs of people thinking about books, a ribbon-cutting ceremony about the future that descends into endless footnotes and never cuts the ribbon. In each of these, and in the naming of clouds, narrative is stalled, undone, or discarded in favour of progressive shifts of register or paradigm, each progressive shift destabilising the certainty of the piece and creating imaginary spaces and potentialities for audiences to invest in.
As we moved through the gallery, redoing the history of clouds soon became a journey of undoing the narrative told by these national museums of art. We worked through a canonized history of clouds in art in order to undo the sedimented layers of a Western concept of clouds, seeing the ways in which these utopian forms have been historically excited and activated as aesthetic mediators of ideological ends. National Gallery was a really useful place to begin deconstructing the idea that clouds have advanced over time, as we could move through these spaces in a non-chronological order, rupturing time as we did so, echoing the rupture marked by Phil's script. Phil was interested to hear about the use of clouds to transport divine figures. We looked at works where this features. I was interested to relate the use of clouds as vehicles for the divine to the mechanization of cloud forms in early modern visual arts and stage mechanics. I remember Phil using the phrase, "convey the divine." I thought that was a really perceptive phrasing. Standing in front of a Cézanne piece, I wrote the following in my notebook. National Portrait Gallery, 8th of September. Cézanne as colours form the atmosphere. Thinking about the new Disney Pixar film, Inside Out, and whether abstraction needs to be figurative. Are these figures in abstraction or abstract figures? Shiraz bathers do not bathe in the water, but in Shiraz blue. How can so much light open from one painting?
At the same time, regarding the pointillism of Shiraz bathers, I considered how, with the discovery of the atom, everything had become a cloud. The clouds are particles, the landscape particles, the lake particles, the bathers particles, all clouds bathing in each other. Again, I considered how we have somehow determined this openness in clouds, how we have determined that they should receive and reflect the projection of the age that they drift through. The work of an artist who was creating real clouds, I was interested in the concrete experience of encountering a cloud and what they actually were.
Clouds convey because we make them convey. Like utopia, they carry what we carry to them. I think it's vital to undo the ambition to master clouds by situating it in relation to the mechanization of clouds, and to forget the strange ambition to understand what clouds are. This question of what clouds are has historically obsessed human beings. Why? At the end of the day, all we have is the light pouring from a painting, the ability to question through that light where we can discover forms, people, and things, and the capacity to stand together before that painting, thinking about the frame, the wood, the walls, the lunch we just had, the frame that pours the light through the clouds.
The pointillism of Shiraz bathers is a cloud form that tangentially relates to real clouds. Discussing this, I was reminded of some Jean-Francois Lyotard that I first read in 2001, and on rereading it, I remembered why I might have been making a piece about clouds in the first place. And this is the quote. "Thoughts are not the fruits of the earth. They are not registered by areas except out of human commodity. Thoughts are clouds. The periphery of thoughts is as immeasurable as the fractal lines of a Benoit Mandelbrot. Thoughts are pushed and pulled at variable speeds. They are deep, although core and skin are of the same grain. Thoughts never stop changing their location one with another. When you feel you have penetrated far into their intimacy in analysing either their so-called structure or genealogy or even post-structure, it is actually too late or too soon." And perhaps this explains partially how I came to this project and why its sources were so varied. I was interested in creating a work like a number of other performances and film works by Forced Entertainment, Goat Island, Derek Jarman, which take place predominantly within the mind of the spectator. These were the frame pouring the light through the cloud. I started to realise that I'd been thinking about and through clouds way before looking at clouds directly. I'd even been inspired by a photograph of the Earth taken from the moon. The photograph includes all living human beings except one, the photographer. I was interested in the experience of being that except one, and wanted to know what would happen if everyone shared the same experience. I wanted to extend an invitation to the audience to drift through these non-spaces of thought, these clouds, with me, and in reverie to potentially share something of that overview experience known by astronauts and those who have ever flown. So it's from the National, it's a simple tube journey to Tate Britain. But with the weather so nice, we decided to walk. This is both the right decision and a mistake. I get us lost. We walk down the Mall and find ourselves at Buckingham Palace. Crowds of tourists are gathered and it is difficult to move through them, and then I take a wrong turn and lead us away from Tate Britain. and it takes us some time to get back. However, this provides us a moment to discuss the aesthetics of reverie and daydream proposed by the piece. The piece itself is intended to be like looking for shapes in clouds. It is also about looking for cloud shapes in things. It should allow the audience to construct their own imaginary context of the piece, and an audience should be allowed, if not encouraged, to become groundless and lose the piece as it progresses. Of note here, the aesthetics of the piece in not directly representing clouds. I wanted to enlist Penny's help to encourage the conceptual rather than physical or representational presence of clouds.
Now, I really appreciate this aspect of Phil's work. The piece, if it really does what it sets out to do, needs not only to debunk the priority of scientific disciplines of classification in the field of the skies, but also to debunk the idea that we need clouds for there to be clouds. Is that not the lesson that the advancement of meteorology through the 19th century teaches us? Clouds come to function in abstraction from themselves, when made assimilable with the morphological linguistic forms, cirrus, cumulus, stratus, and their respective integers. Phil's piece proposes a performative challenge to make clouds assimilable with the imaginary forms that any audience member might bring along, to re-cloud the clouds.
We arrive at Tate Britain, ready for Turner, Constable and other artists who chronologically follow the naming of clouds at the turn of the 19th century. Here, language becomes concrete, rational and measurable. Penny has notes in her notebook from a previous visit. She offers the notebook to me, but unable to read the tiny spidery letters, she reads excerpts, and we pass by the works. I feel like I've become part of a W.G. Sebald novel or the last section of Bruce Chatwin's songlines.
Notes from Tate Britain, 1500 to 1650. You are not beside me, I am beside myself. We begin this way, as ourselves stepping out into history. Portraiture as the dominant of the 1450s, the 1550s, that is, ladies and lords dear their status against a dark envelope of a black background. The clouds plume impossibly, scientifically, unlimited by this comprehension. They hold putti, cloud angels and cherubs, who peep towards the divine, yet fly across the clouds with their wings. Edemonian Porter, 1642-5, black cloud, blue and red sky, a Dionysian hysteria set against an Apollonian symbolism of Porter. Pink clouds, clouds red, clouds in square frames along a flat-bottomed, as expected, please ignore me thing, clouds as background noise. Peter Monamy with his anomaly, ships in distress in a storm, 1720-30. Compare the clarity and definition of this with Turner's sea storm. There is a disconnect. The sea is swelling the ship, the sky is swelling the clouds, but there is no sense in which the storm is swelling the sea. The wind is lost. Richard Wilson's Clouds, 1753. Clouds as a kind of background noise. Wilson seems to me to have used the figurative conventions of clouds to construct the trees. Clouds becoming normalized into painterly conventions. The trees are flocked as clouds, fractal constructions. A British man of war, Charles Brooking. The clouds, are they impossibly or just improbable? The pink, the unfurling, the blackened extensions. It's all very Truman Show in the 18th century. Constructed as if real, but to an ideal of the real. Borrowing from the clouds for trees, the flocking sea. Master Crewe as Henry VIII, 1775. 19th century scientific realism of clouds, limited, confined to the framed area in the top right-hand corner, as if a painting of clouds has entered the frame of the painting of Master Crewe. When does the wind emerge? The Bradshaw family, 1769. The kite creates a thread of wind, an interconnectedness between people and the skies. Constable, Turner, the same gesture, the same hand, to paint the landscape as the landscape of the skies. The drama of the skies exists as a mirror of the drama of the field, which is assembled through or along an axis of the light in the sky and the torch in the hand, such that we do not know which is the field of the painting, the sky or the earth. Nevinson, the dispersal of cloud across a fragmentation of form into structural yet figurative abstraction. Waves across the blue panels, fades of white, tiny dashes of flecks of white paint. We expect sky, so we see sky, like Schendel, like Warhol, even in this.
The walk from Tate Britain to Tate Modern took us past the Houses of Parliament. Having renegotiated the canon of clouds into language of fantasies become realities, aesthetic gestures becoming conventionalized, having explored the variety of ways in which clouds were made analogous to performance, as areas in which to stage images of power and force, either as the vehicle of the divine or of nature, we made a transition to exploring clouds in modernity. It was evident that culture had always been shaping clouds, but in Tate Modern, this felt literal, visceral, disturbing, with industrial smoke, aeroplane flight tracks, pollutants and nefarious mushroom clouds. Rational autobiography, to research, to utopian fiction, to irrational delusion and dystopia, to an ahuman and atopian ecological perspective, to a meta-theatrical feedback and collapse of the house of cards the piece is built upon. The premise, what if people could walk on clouds, ends up taking a dystopian turn. Human nature remains the same, but our material entanglement with the skies alters.
Having listened to Phil describe the dystopian turn taken in the script for the naming of clouds, I was really provoked to rethink an aspect of my work. The Tate Modern contains pieces where we witness the feedback of a history of aestheticizing, conventionalizing, formalizing, naturalizing ideas about clouds. Cloud conventions allow abstract artists to visually and materially pun on clouds. Moreover, within a modernist aesthetic, we find new, technogenic clouds. Both forms of clouds reiterate the cultural substrate to the forms of clouds. I think Phil's work really shifts our perception of this cultural substrate, in that he shows how a changed aerial perspective would lead to a different process of aestheticization, different cloud conventions, and radically altered feedback from these into modernity. This all hinges on a conditional if of the premise, if we could walk on clouds. That conditional recasts the topoi of clouds, not as a space of possibility, but as a space of exploration, privatization, ownership, capital, commodity. I guess the question many postmodern cloud artists are asking is how far this really differs from our current state of affairs. Are we really up in the clouds already, capitalizing these natural forms from a radically altered perspective?
The bridge between Tate Modern and St Paul's was perhaps an ideal endpoint. Here our mutual practices and observation meet in terms of language and conceptual coherence. As we make our way to the Anatomy Museum, we make a plan of actions, and this itself is the concrete formation of a language. Different sections of the script are identified by their function, but through the metaphorical poetics of clouds Penny has created for her research: gatherings, flocks, pockets, feedback. Each section was to be considered a cloud unto itself and should behave like one, forming and dispersing at the very moment of its formation. As such, each part was to begin undoing its own premise at the moment of suggesting it, speaking both to the temporality of clouds as a process of sighting fantasies, imagination, in the forms that constantly unsight themselves, fall apart, and enforce the reactivation, re-excitement of imagination. We also allow activities to take the place of discussion, to start giving this poetics embodied form. We make a series of gestures for clouds. We design a drawing that represents both Penny's research and the structure of the performance. We devise a silent, durational performance inhabiting the world that we've made together. We divide the script into areas of interest and potential intervention. We seek out ways of making new words. We place the performance in the Anatomy Museum. We check the script for consistency and inconsistency within our new construct. Matthew Goolish has described culture as the formation of attention. Through our collaboration, we have engaged in this process of sharing where our attention has been directed and then directing it onto the same subjects. Our attention, as fleeting and as insubstantial as clouds, is, however, just as present. It finds form in our walk, in the activities in the studio, and these actions further refine our fledgling language, defining the collaboration, our practice and research.